The airport lounge fell silent, the soft hum of chatter fading as the confrontation unfolded at the gate. A black family, dressed impeccably, stood before the gate agent. The mother's emerald green blazer shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights, matching the sharpness in her glare. Her husband's tailored navy suit and polished shoes reflected confidence, while their two young children clutched their tablets, confused by the commotion. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with a stiff smile and an unwavering stance, blocked their path. "I'm sorry," she said firmly. "This line is for first-class passengers only." The father, calm but firm, pulled out their boarding passes. "We are first-class passengers." The agent barely glanced at the tickets before shaking her head. "I don't think so. This line is for first-class boarding, not economy upgrades." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd as the family stood their ground. The mother's voice was low and steady, tinged with indignation. "We've paid for these seats, just like everyone else in this line." The agent's fake smile faltered. "Sir, ma'am, I need you to step aside. I don't want to call security." The father inhaled deeply, choosing his words carefully. "We will not move until you explain why we can't board when we've paid for first-class tickets." At that moment, another gate agent whispered something in the first agent's ear. Her face froze, the color draining as her eyes darted toward the father's chest. He wore a lapel pin. Not just any pin, a symbol of the airline's executive team. She had no idea she was standing in front of the owners of the airline. Her mouth opened, then closed, unable to form words. The father raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor now a cold intensity. "Would you care to repeat what you just said about calling security?" The crowd leaned in, captivated. The tension was palpable, the silence deafening. Then the father took out his phone, pressing a single button. He lifted it to his ear and spoke, his voice steady. "We need to address an incident at Gate 27. Now." The gate agent's eyes widened in terror as the realization began to set in. But before she could speak, a man in a sharp suit approached at a brisk pace, his face grim. "Mr. Davis," the man said, addressing the father. "I'm so sorry about this. We'll handle it immediately." The gate agent turned to the new arrival, confused. Who are you?" The man ignored her, focusing solely on the family. "Please, allow me to escort you to the plane." The father glanced at the man, then back at the gate agent. His expression was unreadable. The mother adjusted her blazer, her movements deliberate. The children looked up at their parents, unsure of what was happening. But they all walked forward, past the trembling gate agent, leaving her to grapple with the consequences of her actions. The story begins earlier that day. The Davis family arrived at the bustling airport, their luggage neatly packed, excitement evident on the children's faces. This wasn't just a family vacation, it was a much-needed break after months of hard work. The kids, Emma and Caleb, could hardly contain their joy, talking endlessly about the beaches and theme parks awaiting them. The father, Jonathan Davis, a self-made entrepreneur who had worked his way up from modest beginnings, made sure everything was in order. His wife, Melanie, a renowned attorney, kept the kids in check while staying on top of her work emails. They exuded success and discipline, their journey a testament to perseverance. At the check-in counter, things had gone smoothly. The airline staff were polite, even going so far as to compliment their children on their behavior. "You've raised some very polite kids," the attendant had said with a smile, handing over their boarding passes. Jonathan and Melanie exchanged a small smile, proud of the values they had instilled in their children. Once through security, the family grabbed a quick meal before heading to the first-class lounge. They had earned this, after all. Years of sacrifice and hard work had led to this moment, flying in the comfort they deserved. The lounge staff greeted them warmly, directing them to a quiet corner with plush seats and snacks for the kids. Caleb dove into a plate of cookies, while Emma curled up with her tablet. Jonathan sipped his coffee, enjoying a rare moment of peace. It was a perfect start to their trip, until it wasn't. As boarding time approached, they gathered their belongings and walked toward the gate. The kids, full of energy, skipped ahead, thrilled by the idea of flying. Melanie held onto her husband's arm, chatting about their itinerary. When they reached the gate, the mood shifted. A line of passengers waited to board first class, the majority of them white. Jonathan caught a few glances from the other travelers, subtle but unmistakable. He was used to this, a lifetime of proving he belonged in spaces where people assumed he didn't. Melanie leaned in and whispered, "We're not going to let anyone ruin this trip. Let's just get on the plane and relax. Jonathan nodded, his jaw tightening. He handed their boarding passes to the gate agent, expecting a routine check. Instead, she paused, her eyes flickering to the family before scanning the tickets again. And that's when it began. The gate agent's words replayed in Melanie's mind as they were escorted to the plane. This line is for first-class passengers only. The condescension, the implication that they couldn't possibly belong, stung more than she cared to admit. She looked at her husband, who held his head high, his shoulders squared. They settled into their seats, the children marveling at the spacious cabin. But Melanie couldn't relax. She glanced back toward the gate, wondering if the agent truly understood the magnitude of her mistake. Jonathan leaned over and whispered, "Let's not let this ruin our trip. Focus on the kids." Melanie nodded, though her mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. She glanced at the lapel pin on her husband's suit, the symbol of their silent authority. The gate agent had made an error, one she wouldn't forget. The plane doors closed, and the engines roared to life. But the tension lingered, a storm brewing beneath the surface. What would happen when the truth came to light? As the plane climbed steadily into the clouds, the tension from the gate incident still lingered. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, his face calm but his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Melanie, seated beside him, watched her children with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Caleb and Emma were giggling over the in-flight entertainment, completely unaware of the storm that had just passed, or the one still brewing. The first-class cabin was quiet, except for the occasional clink of glasses as flight attendants served drinks and snacks. Jonathan glanced around. It wasn't lost on him how many curious eyes flickered toward his family, some darting away quickly when caught. He had learned long ago how to read a room, and this one was buzzing with silent judgment. Melanie sighed and reached for his hand. "John, let it go for now. The kids are excited. Let's focus on that." Jonathan turned to her, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I know, Mel. But you saw what happened back there. She didn't even look at our tickets. She made up her mind before we said a word." "I know," Melanie said quietly. "And she'll face the consequences. Just, not here. Not now." Jonathan nodded, his jaw tightening, and focused on his children. They were all that mattered. For now, he would let it go. A few rows back, the whispers started. "Did you see what happened at the gate?" A woman murmured to her husband, tilting her head toward the Davis family. That poor agent looked like she'd seen a ghost. Her husband, a silver-haired man in a crisp business suit, shrugged. "Probably just an upgrade dispute. Happens all the time." The woman frowned. "No, I think it was more than that. Did you see the guy's pin? It looked like something official." "Probably a frequent flyer thing," the man said dismissively, sipping his drink. "Let it go, Lisa." Lisa bit her lip, glancing again at the Davis family. Something about the way they carried themselves, particularly the father, didn't sit right with her. Not in a bad way, but in a way that suggested there was more to the story. She made a mental note to watch closely. In the cockpit, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Jonathan smiled at his children's excitement as the flight attendant approached with their meals. Caleb, always the talkative one, asked her a flurry of questions about the plane and the food, his eyes wide with wonder. Emma, more reserved, quietly thanked the attendant and returned to her tablet. "Your children are adorable," the flight attendant said warmly, smiling at Melanie and Jonathan. Her genuine kindness was a stark contrast to the gate agent's behavior, and it softened Melanie's mood. "Thank you," Melanie replied, her smile more genuine this time. "They've been looking forward to this trip for months." The attendant nodded, setting their drinks on the tray. "If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." As she walked away, Jonathan leaned toward Melanie. "At least someone here knows how to do their job." Melanie chuckled softly. Small victories. Hours passed, and the tension began to ease. Caleb had fallen asleep with his headphones askew, while Emma was engrossed in a movie. Jonathan and Melanie shared a quiet conversation about their plans for the trip, their earlier frustration gradually giving way to excitement. Then, just as the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for landing, the man in the sharp suit, the same one who had appeared at the gate, emerged from the business class section. His face was drawn, his steps purposeful as he approached the Davis family. Jonathan straightened in his seat, his expression instantly alert. Melanie too tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for her husband's arm. "Mr. Davis," the man said quietly, his voice careful. "May I have a word?" Jonathan glanced at his wife, who nodded slightly. He unbuckled his seatbelt and rose to follow the man toward the front of the plane. The conversation took place in the galley, just out of earshot of the passengers. The man, who introduced himself as Charles Miller, the airline's regional director, looked visibly uncomfortable. "I want to start by apologizing for what happened at the gate," Charles began, his voice low. "The agent's behavior was completely unacceptable and doesn't reflect our company's values." Jonathan crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Unacceptable is an understatement, Charles. She humiliated my family in front of a crowd, without any justification." Charles nodded quickly. "I understand, sir. And I assure you, we're addressing it. But there's something else you should know." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, waiting. Charles hesitated, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one else could hear. "She didn't just make a mistake. She violated company protocol in a way that suggests something more intentional." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" "She flagged your account in our system," Charles explained. "Specifically, she added a note questioning your legitimacy as a first-class passenger. That's why she didn't let you board initially." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Charles continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I don't think she knew who you were. But when she realized, when she saw your PIN, she panicked. That's why she backed down so quickly." Jonathan's voice was calm but icy. "And what are you planning to do about it?" Charles swallowed hard. "The incident is under review, and the agent will face disciplinary action. But given the circumstances, I thought it was important to inform you personally." Jonathan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you for letting me know." He turned to leave, but Charles spoke again, his tone hesitant. "Sir, one more thing." Jonathan paused, glancing back. "What?" "The CEO has been informed," Charles said carefully. "And he's requested a meeting with you as soon as you land." Jonathan's expression didn't change, but his mind raced. A meeting with the CEO? That was unexpected. Without another word, he returned to his seat, his face a mask of calm. Melanie looked at him questioningly, but he shook his head slightly, indicating they would discuss it later. As the plane began its descent, the tension returned, though it was now mixed with anticipation. Jonathan and Melanie exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that this was far from over. The plane touched down smoothly, and the passengers began gathering their belongings. Jonathan kept his eyes on the gate, his mind already preparing for whatever awaited them. When the cabin doors opened, a uniformed employee was waiting just outside, holding a sign with Jonathan's name. Melanie squeezed his hand, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "It's going to be fine," Jonathan said softly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. As they stepped off the plane, the gate agent's face appeared briefly in the crowd. She looked pale, her eyes wide with fear. But the Davis family didn't stop. They walked forward, toward the unknown, leaving the agent behind to face the consequences of her actions. Whatever was coming next, Jonathan knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Jonathan stepped into the sleek black sedan waiting for them just beyond the terminal. The driver greeted them warmly, but his tone carried an edge of formality that hinted at the significance of what was to come. Melanie, Caleb, and Emma settled in beside him, their questions unspoken but evident in their expressions. The ride was quiet, except for the hum of the engine and the occasional question from Caleb about the city they were driving through. As they approached the airline's corporate office, a gleaming high-rise building with reflective glass windows that seemed to touch the clouds, Jonathan's thoughts turned to the gate agent. Her pale, trembling face flashed in his mind. There was more to her actions than simple ignorance or bias, and he was determined to find out exactly what had happened. The car pulled up to the main entrance, where another suited man waited. His name tag identified him as Peter Walsh, Chief Operating Officer of the airline. Jonathan had seen his name in internal memos, but had never met him in person. Peter opened the car door with a polished smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Davis, Mrs. Davis, welcome," Peter said, extending a hand. "I'm Peter Walsh, COO. We've arranged for a private meeting upstairs." Jonathan accepted the handshake, his grip firm. "I assume this meeting will clarify what happened today?" Peter's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. Absolutely. We want to address this directly and ensure it never happens again. Jonathan nodded, then glanced at Melanie, who held Caleb and Emma close. My family is coming with me. Peter hesitated, then nodded. Of course. Right this way. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent except for the soft chime of passing floors. Caleb and Emma looked around in awe, their curiosity temporarily distracting them from the tension. Melanie held Jonathan's hand, her grip reassuring but firm. The doors opened to reveal an opulent conference room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and a long polished table sat in the center, surrounded by high-backed chairs. At the head of the table stood a man in his late 50s, his silver hair neatly combed, his tailored suit exuding authority. Mr. Davis, the man said, stepping forward. I'm Robert Steele, CEO of the Airline. Please, have a seat. Jonathan didn't move immediately. He studied Robert's face, searching for sincerity. Finally, he nodded and guided his family to the table. Once they were seated, Robert began. First, let me extend my sincerest apologies for what happened at the gate. That behavior is not reflective of who we are as a company. Jonathan's expression remained neutral. It happened. So let's talk about why. Robert exchanged a glance with Peter, then folded his hands on the table. We've conducted a preliminary review, and the gate agent's actions were not only unprofessional but also in direct violation of company policy. She's been suspended pending a full investigation. That's a start, Jonathan said. But I want to know why she felt so comfortable treating my family like we didn't belong. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic. Robert nodded gravely. I understand your frustration. And you're absolutely right. This isn't just about one person. It's about a culture that allowed this to happen. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. So what's your plan to fix it? Robert hesitated, then said, We're launching a comprehensive review of our training programs, hiring practices, and internal policies. But before we go further, there's something else you need to know. The room grew tense. Melanie shifted in her seat, her protective instincts on high alert. Robert took a deep breath. The gate agent flagged your account in our system. This was an intentional act, not a mistake. She specifically targeted your family. Jonathan's face hardened. Why? Peter interjected, his voice cautious. We don't have the full picture yet, but initial findings suggest it was based on assumptions she made about your family, assumptions rooted in prejudice. Melanie's eyes narrowed. So, you're telling me this was racial profiling? Peter glanced at Robert, who nodded. Yes, Robert admitted. And that's why we're taking this so seriously. Jonathan sat back, his mind racing. He wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed brought a fresh wave of anger. And what about her? What happens to her now? She'll face disciplinary action, Robert said. But there's more. During the review of her account, we discovered something alarming. She's done this before. Jonathan's eyes widened. To other passengers? Yes, Peter said, though not to the same extent. It appears she's developed a pattern of targeting passengers she deems undesirable. Melanie shook her head in disbelief. And no one caught this until now? Robert's expression was grim. It was missed, an oversight we deeply regret. But we're committed to making this right. Jonathan's voice was cold. Making it right won't erase what happened to my family. You can't undo that. You're right, Robert said. But we're prepared to take meaningful steps to ensure it doesn't happen again. And we're here to listen to your input on how we can do better. Jonathan stared at him, weighing his words. Finally, he nodded. We'll see. But this isn't the end of the conversation. As the meeting concluded, Robert extended an olive branch. We'd like to offer your family an all-expenses-paid vacation as an apology. Anywhere you'd like to go. Jonathan's jaw tightened. You think a free vacation will fix this? No, Robert said quickly. But it's a gesture of goodwill. And we'll cover today's flight costs as well. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. He glanced at Melanie, who gave a slight nod. Finally, he said, Fine. But this isn't over. As they exited the building, Caleb tugged on Jonathan's sleeve. Dad, are we still going on our trip? Jonathan knelt to his son's level, his expression softening. Yes, buddy. We're still going. Caleb grinned, and Emma gave her father a quick hug. Melanie placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "We'll get through this," she said softly. Jonathan nodded, his resolve solidifying. He had built his life on persistence and integrity, and he wouldn't let this incident define their family. But deep down, he knew this fight wasn't just for them. It was for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. As they returned to the car, the gate agent's face flashed in Jonathan's mind again. Her actions had started this chain of events, but they had also uncovered something much bigger. And he wasn't about to let it go. Not yet. The Davis family finally arrived at their resort later that evening. The sprawling beachfront property, with its luxurious amenities and pristine ocean views, should have been the perfect setting to relax and enjoy their vacation. Caleb and Emma were immediately distracted by the sight of the massive swimming pool, while Melanie clutched Jonathan's hand, trying to pull his focus back to the present. "Let's give the kids a vacation they'll remember," she said softly, her voice steady. "We'll deal with everything else when we get back." Jonathan nodded, his expression softening as he watched Caleb and Emma race toward the pool with squeals of excitement. For their sake, he resolved to push the day's events to the back of his mind, for now. The resort staff were warm and accommodating, their cheerful demeanor a welcome change from the tension at the airport. The concierge handed them a schedule of activities, and Melanie immediately began planning a day filled with snorkeling and paddleboarding. Caleb and Emma's excitement became contagious, and Jonathan finally felt himself relax as they settled into their suite. But the calm didn't last long. The first crack in their peace came the next morning. Jonathan was sipping his coffee on the balcony, overlooking the ocean, when his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but something told him to answer. "Mr. Davis," a sharp voice said before he could speak. "This is Linda Garrison from the Airline's legal department. We need to discuss the incident at the airport." Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. "I've already had a conversation with the CEO. What else is there to discuss?" Linda's tone was brisk. "There's been a new development. The gate agent has retained legal counsel, and she's claiming that her actions were misinterpreted. She's suggesting that she acted within the bounds of her duties." Jonathan's jaw clenched. "Misinterpreted? She outright blocked my family from boarding a flight we had every right to be on." "I understand your frustration," Linda said, her voice cool. "But the agent is alleging that she was following a standard protocol related to ticket verification." "That's a lie," Jonathan said flatly. "She didn't check our tickets until we insisted." "That may be true," Linda replied. "But the airline has to tread carefully. If her claims gain traction, it could complicate the disciplinary process." Jonathan's mind raced. "Are you telling me you're considering letting her off the hook?" "No," Linda said quickly. "But I wanted you to be aware of the situation. The investigation is ongoing, and the outcome may not be as straightforward as we'd like." Jonathan exhaled sharply. "Thank you for letting me know." He ended the call, his mood darkened. Melanie stepped onto the balcony, concern etched on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked. Jonathan hesitated, then told her about the call. Melanie's eyes narrowed as she listened, her hands gripping the railing. "She's trying to twist this into something it's not," Melanie said. "We can't let her get away with it." "We won't," Jonathan said firmly. "But for now, let's focus on the kids." Melanie nodded, though the tension in her jaw remained. The day's activities went as planned. Caleb and Emma splashed in the waves, their laughter echoing across the beach. Jonathan and Melanie joined them, determined to create happy memories despite the storm brewing in the background. By the time they returned to their suite, everyone was exhausted but content. Caleb and Emma fell asleep almost immediately, their sun-kissed faces peaceful. Melanie and Jonathan sat on the balcony, enjoying the quiet. But just as they began to unwind, Jonathan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from Charles Miller, the airline's regional director. "Mr. Davis, there's something you should see. Check your email." Jonathan opened his laptop, his heart sinking as he read the subject line of the email: "Confidential, internal findings regarding gate agent incident." The message contained a report detailing the gate agent's actions. It confirmed everything the Davis family suspected, and more. The gate agent had a documented history of complaints from passengers of color, all citing similar behavior. But what stood out most was a memo buried in the attached files, written by the gate agent herself. "Certain passengers don't reflect the airline's image. We need to maintain a standard of clientele in first class." Jonathan's hands shook as he read the words. Melanie leaned over his shoulder, her face pale. She actually wrote that? Apparently, Jonathan said, his voice tight. And someone in management approved it. Melanie gasped. What? Jonathan scrolled down to another document, a response from her direct supervisor. It was brief but damning, noted. Be discreet. Jonathan slammed the laptop shut, his mind reeling. The gate agent wasn't just acting on her own prejudices, she was following a toxic directive embedded in the company's culture. The implications were staggering. This isn't just about her, Jonathan said, his voice low. This is systemic. Melanie nodded, her eyes blazing with determination. Then we take it higher. We expose them. Jonathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. We will. But we need to be smart about it. This isn't just about us anymore. It's bigger than that. Melanie placed a hand on his arm. You're right. But whatever we do it together. Jonathan nodded, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just a fight for their family. It was a fight for every family who had ever been treated as less than. As the night deepened, Jonathan opened his laptop again, determined to document every detail of what they had uncovered. But just as he began typing, a notification popped up on his screen. Incoming call, Robert Steele, CEO. Jonathan exchanged a glance with Melanie. This can't be good. He answered the call, bracing himself. Jonathan, Robert's voice came through, strained. We need to talk. Something's come to my attention that you'll want to hear. Jonathan's stomach tightened. Go on. There was a pause, then Robert said, It's about the memo you just read. There's more to it than you know. The line went silent, and Jonathan's heart pounded. What do you mean? Robert hesitated, then said, The person who signed off on it wasn't just her supervisor. It's someone much higher up. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. How high? Robert's next words sent a chill down his spine. All the way to the top. Jonathan stared at the phone, Robert's words echoing in his mind. All the way to the top. Explain, Jonathan demanded, his voice low and controlled, though his heart raced. Melanie leaned closer, her expression a mix of shock and anger. Robert sighed heavily. The memo you read wasn't an isolated directive. It's part of a long-standing but unspoken policy among certain upper management circles. They believe first-class clientele should adhere to a certain profile. Jonathan's jaw clenched. And by profile, you mean white. Robert hesitated but then admitted, yes. The silence on the line was deafening. Melanie's hand gripped Jonathan's shoulder, grounding him as his thoughts churned. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold. How did this policy go unnoticed for so long? It didn't go unnoticed, Robert said, his tone bitter. It was intentionally buried. And to be honest, I only became fully aware of it recently. It's been hidden in coded language and informal practices, but the memo you found makes it undeniable. Jonathan exhaled sharply. And you're telling me this now because I want to fix it, Robert said firmly. But I need your help. Jonathan barked out a humorless laugh. My help? After what your company just put my family through. Exactly, Robert said. You have a voice in this now, Jonathan. You've seen the rot firsthand. You have the power to expose it, and to hold us accountable. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. And what happens to the people who signed off on this? What happens to the gate agent? Robert's tone turned grim. There will be consequences, I can promise you that. But the gate agent is just the tip of the iceberg. If we don't address the root of this issue, it'll keep happening. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. His thoughts raced, weighing the options. Finally, he said, I'll think about it. Robert sounded relieved. Thank you, Jonathan. I'll be in touch. The call ended, leaving Jonathan and Melanie in heavy silence. Finally, Melanie spoke, her voice steady but filled with resolve. We can't let them sweep this under the rug. Jonathan nodded slowly. We won't. But we need to be strategic. If this goes public, they'll try to spin it. Melanie crossed her arms. Then we make sure they can't. We gather every piece of evidence we can, and we tell the truth. Jonathan looked at her, his resolve hardening. You're right. This isn't just about our family anymore. It's about everyone who's been silenced by people like them. The next morning, Jonathan woke early, his mind still buzzing with the weight of the revelations. Melanie was already awake, sitting at the small table in their suite with her laptop open. She had begun compiling the documents they'd received, organizing them into a timeline. "We need to be thorough," she said without looking up. "If we're going to expose this, we need to make sure there's no room for denial." Jonathan sat beside her, reviewing the files. The more he read, the angrier he became. The memos, the complaints, the blatant disregard for basic human dignity, it all painted a picture of a culture steeped in systemic discrimination. But as they worked, there was a knock at the door. Jonathan frowned and stood, motioning for Melanie to stay put. He opened the door cautiously, revealing a young woman in a crisp suit. She held a folder and looked nervous. "Mr. Davis?" she asked. "Yes," Jonathan said, his tone wary. "My name is Clara Harris. I work in the airline's internal investigations team," she said quickly. "I need to speak with you." Jonathan studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." Clara entered, her movements stiff with tension. Melanie closed her laptop, her eyes narrowing as she watched the woman. "What's this about?" Jonathan asked. Clara hesitated, then handed him the folder. "I thought you should see this. It's an internal report we've been working on. I shouldn't even have access to some of this, but after what happened at the gate, I couldn't stay silent." Jonathan opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. They included emails, memos, and even handwritten notes, all pointing to a coordinated effort to exclude certain demographics from first-class spaces. The language was often veiled, but the intent was clear. "This is extensive," Melanie said, leaning over to read. Clara nodded. "It goes deeper than anyone realizes. I'm risking my job by coming here, but I couldn't let this continue. Someone has to speak up." Jonathan closed the folder, his mind racing. "Why bring this to us?" Clara straightened, her expression earnest. "Because you have the platform to make this public. If this stays within the company, it'll be swept under the rug. But if you go public, it'll force change." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Melanie. She nodded, her expression resolute. "Thank you, Clara," Jonathan said. "We'll take it from here." Clara nodded and turned to leave but paused at the door. "Be careful," she said softly. "They won't go down without a fight." That evening, Jonathan and Melanie reviewed the new information. The evidence was overwhelming, but it also painted a target on their backs. If they moved forward, they would be taking on a powerful corporation with vast resources. "Are we ready for this?" Jonathan asked quietly. Melanie looked at him, her eyes fierce. "We've faced worse. And this isn't just about us. It's about doing what's right." Jonathan nodded, his resolve solidifying. "Then let's do it." The next morning, Jonathan made a series of phone calls. First, to a trusted journalist he had worked with in the past. Then, to a legal team specializing in civil rights cases. By the end of the day, the wheels were in motion. But as they prepared for the fallout, Jonathan received another call, this time from Robert Steele. "Jonathan," Robert said, his voice tense. "I hear you've been talking to the press." Jonathan didn't deny it. "Yes, I have." Robert sighed heavily. "I was hoping we could handle this internally." "I'm sure you were," Jonathan said coldly. "But that's not how this works anymore." There was a long pause. Then Robert said, "You should know, the people involved in this won't go down quietly. They'll fight back." Jonathan's voice was steady. "Then let them." The sun rose over the resort, casting a golden glow on the waves crashing along the shore. Jonathan stood on the balcony, watching the ocean and replaying Robert's warning in his mind. The people involved in this won't go down quietly. He knew the days ahead would be turbulent, but his resolve was unshaken. This wasn't just about exposing a single incident, it was about dismantling a system that had gone unchecked for far too long. Inside the suite, Melanie was on a video call with their newly retained legal counsel, a formidable team of civil rights attorneys who had handled cases against major corporations. Caleb and Emma, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them, played with their tablet games, laughing occasionally. Jonathan walked back inside, catching the tail end of Melanie's conversation. "Yes, we have the documents ready. We'll send them to you by this afternoon," Melanie said, her tone professional but firm. She ended the call and looked at Jonathan. "The lawyers are confident we have a strong case. With the internal documents Clara provided, the airline won't be able to deny the systemic nature of this issue." Jonathan nodded. "Good. But we need to stay ahead of them. If Robert's right, they're going to fight back hard. Melanie's eyes narrowed. Let them. They've gotten away with this for too long. Later that day, Jonathan received a call from the journalist he had reached out to, a sharp and tenacious reporter named Alicia Carter. She had built her career exposing corporate scandals and was eager to take on the story. "I've gone through the documents you sent me," Alicia said. "This is bigger than I thought. We're talking about a culture of discrimination that spans years." Jonathan leaned against the balcony railing. "That's why we need to make this public. They've buried this for too long." Alicia's voice was steady. "I'm drafting the story now, but I need a statement from you. Something that highlights why this matters, not just for your family, but for everyone affected by their practices." Jonathan thought for a moment, then said, "This isn't just about my family being denied our seats. It's about the message they've sent to countless others, that they don't belong, that they're less deserving. It's time for that message to change." Alicia's tone softened. "Powerful. I'll include it in the piece. We're aiming to publish by tomorrow morning." "Thank you, Alicia," Jonathan said. "This means a lot." "No," Alicia replied. "Thank you for standing up." As the day progressed, Jonathan and Melanie began to feel the weight of their decision. They knew the airline's response would be swift and aggressive, and they braced themselves for what was to come. That evening, they gathered Caleb and Emma and took them for a walk along the beach, hoping to soak in a moment of peace before the storm hit. The kids laughed as they splashed in the shallow waves, their joy a stark contrast to the tension Jonathan and Melanie felt. For a brief moment, Jonathan allowed himself to relax, watching his children play and holding Melanie's hand as the sun dipped below the horizon. But the calm didn't last long. The next morning, Jonathan's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. The article had gone live, and the fallout was immediate. Alicia's piece was thorough and damning, detailing the Davis family's experience and the broader pattern of discrimination within the airline. The memos and internal documents were included, leaving little room for the airline to deny the allegations. Social media erupted. The story went viral within hours, with hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #AirlineJustice trending nationwide. Celebrities, activists, and everyday travelers weighed in, calling for accountability and boycotts. Jonathan scrolled through the comments, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. The world was finally paying attention, but the backlash from the airline was inevitable. By midday, the airline released a statement. "We take these allegations very seriously and are conducting a thorough internal investigation. We remain committed to fostering an inclusive environment for all our passengers." The response was met with widespread criticism. Commentators called it a non-apology and demanded concrete action. Jonathan's phone buzzed with messages from journalists, activists, and supporters, all eager to amplify the story. But then came the first strike from the airline. Jonathan received an email from a high-powered PR firm representing the company, accusing him of misrepresenting the incident and threatening legal action if he continued to speak publicly. Jonathan showed the email to Melanie, who read it with a scowl. "This is their attempt to scare us. They know they can't win in court, so they're trying to intimidate us into silence." Jonathan nodded. "We're not backing down." That evening, as the family sat in their suite, the news took another turn. A whistleblower from the airline's HR department came forward, providing even more damning evidence of discriminatory practices. The whistleblower, who remained anonymous, described a culture where employees were encouraged to quietly steer certain passengers away from first-class seats, and how complaints about such practices were routinely ignored. The revelations added fuel to the fire. News outlets picked up the story, and the pressure on the airline mounted. Shareholders began demanding answers, and rumors of high-level resignations swirled. Jonathan felt a sense of vindication but also knew the fight wasn't over. That night, as he and Melanie prepared for bed, he turned to her. "This is bigger than we ever imagined," he said quietly. "But we're doing the right thing." Melanie nodded, her eyes steady. "And we'll see it through. No matter what." The next morning, a new challenge arose. Jonathan's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. When he answered, a man's voice greeted him. "Mr. Davis, this is Mark Reynolds. I'm the airline's chief legal officer. We need to meet." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because this is escalating faster than anyone anticipated," Mark said. "And I think we can find a resolution that works for everyone." Jonathan's voice was firm. "I'm not interested in sweeping this under the rug." "That's not what I'm proposing," Mark replied. "But if this continues to spiral, It could hurt a lot of people, not just the airline. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Is that a threat? No, Mark said quickly. It's an invitation. Let's talk. Face to face. Jonathan paused, considering. Finally he said, where? Mark gave him the address of a nearby office building. Tomorrow morning. Bring your legal team if you'd like. Jonathan ended the call and turned to Melanie. They're scrambling. They want a meeting. Melanie's eyes narrowed. We're not going without backup. Jonathan nodded. Agreed. But if they think we're backing down, they're in for a surprise. The next morning promised another battle, and Jonathan was ready to face it head-on. Jonathan arrived at the downtown office building early the next morning, flanked by Melanie and 2 members of their legal team. The air was thick with anticipation as they walked through the glass doors and into the sleek lobby, where a receptionist greeted them with a forced smile. Mr. Davis, they're expecting you in conference room A, she said, gesturing toward the elevators. Jonathan nodded, his face impassive, and led the group to the designated room. As they entered, they were greeted by a group of corporate representatives, including Mark Reynolds, the airline's chief legal officer. Mark stood to greet them, his demeanor calm but guarded. Mr. Davis, Mrs. Davis, Mark said, extending a hand. Thank you for coming. Jonathan ignored the gesture and took a seat at the table, his lawyers following suit. Melanie sat beside him, her gaze unwavering. Let's get to it, Jonathan said. Why are we here? Mark cleared his throat, glancing at the other executives seated around the table. We understand the gravity of the situation and the impact it's had, not just on your family but on our company's reputation. We'd like to find a way forward that addresses your concerns while minimizing further damage. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Damage to who? Your company or the people you've systematically discriminated against? Mark hesitated, his composure faltering for a moment. To everyone involved. One of Jonathan's lawyers leaned forward, his tone sharp. If you're suggesting some kind of settlement to buy their silence, let me stop you right there. That's not going to happen. Mark shook his head quickly. That's not what we're suggesting. We're prepared to implement sweeping changes, starting with the termination of individuals directly responsible for these policies. And? Jonathan prompted, his voice cold. And, Mark continued, we're proposing a partnership with your family to help us rebuild trust with our customers. We want you to be part of shaping the reforms that will ensure this never happens again. Melanie scoffed. You want us to clean up your mess for you? Mark held up a hand. No, that's not what I mean. We're acknowledging that we failed. This is our way of making amends. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And what about the people who put these policies in place? The ones who signed off on them? Mark hesitated. We're conducting a full review. Anyone found complicit will face consequences. Jonathan's voice was like steel. That's not good enough. I want names, and I want to know what those consequences will be. Mark exchanged a nervous glance with the executives beside him. That information will be part of our internal investigation. But we're committed to transparency. Jonathan folded his arms, his gaze piercing. Transparency starts with accountability. If you're serious about change, you'll make the results of that investigation public. Mark nodded slowly. We can do that. One of Jonathan's lawyers interjected. We'll need more than verbal assurances. We'll draft an agreement outlining the specific actions the airline will take. If you deviate from it, the full weight of this case will come crashing down on you. Mark's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Understood. The meeting lasted for hours as both sides hashed out the details of the agreement. By the end, Jonathan and Melanie felt a measure of progress but knew the battle wasn't over. The airline had promised sweeping reforms, but the Davis family had learned not to trust words alone. As they left the building, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Alicia Carter, the journalist who had broken the story. Jonathan, I just got a tip you need to see. Call me ASAP. Jonathan stepped aside and dialed her number. Alicia answered on the first ring. What's going on? Jonathan asked. Alicia's voice was tense. I've been digging into the airline's leadership, and I found something you're going to want to hear. The gate agent wasn't just following company culture. She was following orders from someone high up. Jonathan's stomach tightened. How high? High enough to explain why they're scrambling, Alicia said. I've got the proof. Meet me tonight, And I'll show you. Jonathan ended the call, his mind racing. He turned to Melanie. It's not over. There's more. Melanie's eyes narrowed. What now? I don't know yet, Jonathan said. But we're going to find out. That evening, Jonathan and Melanie met Alicia at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. Alicia looked tense as she slid a folder across the table. Inside were emails, memos, and meeting notes implicating a senior vice president in orchestrating the discriminatory policies. The evidence was damning, with explicit instructions to enforce unofficial standards for first-class passengers. They knew exactly what they were doing, Alicia said. This wasn't just prejudice, it was policy. Jonathan clenched his fists, his anger simmering just below the surface. And this senior vice president is still employed? For now, Alicia said. But with this evidence, they won't be for long. Melanie's voice was sharp. We need to make this public. Alicia nodded. I can publish the story, but you need to be ready for the fallout. This will take the fight to a whole new level. Jonathan exchanged a glance with Melanie, then nodded. Do it. The next morning, Alicia's story hit the news. The revelation of a senior executive's involvement in the discriminatory policies sent shockwaves through the airline and the public. The outcry was immediate and intense, with calls for the executive's resignation and demands for justice. The airline scrambled to respond, issuing a statement announcing the executive's suspension pending further investigation. But the damage was done. Shareholders demanded accountability, and consumer advocacy groups called for boycotts until significant reforms were implemented. Jonathan watched the news coverage from their suite, his emotions a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. Melanie sat beside him, her hand resting on his. We're making a difference, she said softly. This is what needed to happen. Jonathan nodded, though his mind was already on what came next. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, it felt like they were winning. The fallout from Alicia's latest story was swift and brutal. The senior vice president implicated in the discriminatory policies resigned within hours of the report's release. News outlets broadcast the scandal non-stop, dissecting every detail of the airline's toxic culture. Social media erupted with anger, amplifying calls for a full-scale overhaul of the company's leadership. Jonathan sat at the dining table in their suite, scrolling through the headlines. Melanie brought him a cup of coffee and sat down across from him, her eyes searching his face. They're finally facing the consequences, she said, her tone resolute. But does it feel like enough? Jonathan shook his head. Not yet. The system that let this happen is still in place. This isn't just about one person resigning, it's about making sure this never happens again. Melanie leaned forward. Then we keep going. Jonathan nodded, his determination renewed. Just as he was about to respond, his phone buzzed with a call. The number was familiar, Robert Steele, the airline's CEO. Jonathan hesitated, then answered. Robert. Jonathan, Robert said, his voice strained. I need to see you. In person. Jonathan's tone was cold. Why? So you can try to salvage what's left of your reputation. No, Robert said quickly. This is about the future of the airline, and your role in it. Jonathan's brow furrowed. My role. Please, Robert said. Just meet with me. You'll understand. Jonathan exchanged a glance with Melanie, who nodded subtly. Fine, he said. Where? My office, Robert replied. I'll send a car. Jonathan ended the call and leaned back in his chair. He's desperate. Melanie crossed her arms. Good. Let's see what he has to say. A black car arrived an hour later to take Jonathan and Melanie to the airline's headquarters. The building, a towering structure of glass and steel, loomed over the city like a fortress. Jonathan had been here once before years ago, when he and Melanie first became silent investors in the airline. Back then, it had symbolized opportunity. Now, it represented everything they were fighting against. Inside, they were escorted to Robert's office on the top floor. The space was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Robert stood as they entered, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a weary expression. Jonathan, Melanie, he said, extending a hand. Thank you for coming. Jonathan ignored the gesture and sat down. Melanie followed suit, her gaze steady and unflinching. What do you want, Robert? Jonathan asked bluntly. Robert sat across from them, his hands clasped tightly. I'm here to propose a partnership. A real one. We've made mistakes, big ones, but I believe we can fix this together. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. You think I want to work with you after what my family went through? Robert's voice softened. I think you want change. And the best way to make that happen is from the inside. Melanie spoke up, her tone sharp. Why should we trust you? Your company has been complicit in systemic discrimination for years. You're only coming to us now because you've been exposed. Robert nodded, acknowledging the point. You're right. We should have acted sooner. But now that the truth is out, we have a chance to rebuild, to create something better. And we need people like you to lead that effort. Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze piercing. What exactly are you offering? Robert took a deep breath. We're forming an independent oversight committee to review all policies, practices, and personnel decisions. I want you to chair it. Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. You want me to chair it? Yes, Robert said. You've seen firsthand what needs to change. You've already forced us to confront our failures. Who better to lead this effort? Jonathan's mind raced. The offer was unexpected, but it carried the weight of real influence. If he accepted, he could directly shape the reforms the airline desperately needed. But it also meant aligning himself, at least partially, with the very institution he was fighting to hold accountable. Melanie's voice broke through his thoughts. And what about the people who've been affected by your policies? How do you plan to make this right for them? Robert nodded. We're committing significant resources to compensating passengers who faced discrimination. And we'll fund scholarships, community programs, and initiatives to support underrepresented groups in the aviation industry. Jonathan crossed his arms. Words are cheap. How do we know you'll follow through? You'll have full transparency, Robert said. Every decision, every dollar spent, it'll all go through the oversight committee. Jonathan leaned back, considering. Finally, he said, I'll think about it. Robert looked relieved. That's all I ask. Back at the resort, Jonathan and Melanie sat on the balcony, discussing the offer. The sun was setting, casting the ocean in hues of gold and crimson. What do you think? Melanie asked. Jonathan sighed. It's a chance to make real change. But it feels like letting them off the hook. Melanie nodded. I get that. But this isn't just about punishing them. It's about ensuring no one else has to go through what we did. Jonathan looked out at the horizon, his mind made up. Then we do it. But on our terms. Melanie smiled, placing a hand on his. On our terms. The next day, Jonathan called Robert and accepted the offer. The news broke soon after, sparking a wave of reactions. Some praised the decision, calling it a step toward accountability. Others were skeptical, questioning whether the airline was truly committed to change. Jonathan ignored the noise. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready. This wasn't just a fight for his family anymore. It was a fight for justice, equality, and the future of an industry that needed to change. As he stood with Melanie, watching Caleb and Emma play on the beach, he felt a sense of purpose. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time, he could see a path forward. The news of Jonathan Davis chairing the Independent Oversight Committee spread like wildfire. It dominated headlines, with commentators debating whether it was a genuine step toward reform or a calculated move to rehabilitate the airline's reputation. Social media buzzed with opinions, some applauding Jonathan's courage, others questioning his decision to work with the company. Jonathan ignored the noise and focused on the task ahead. The first committee meeting was scheduled for the following week, and he was determined to come prepared. Melanie threw herself into helping him, combing through the mountain of evidence they had collected and compiling a comprehensive plan of action. The morning of the first meeting, Jonathan dressed in a crisp suit and stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. Melanie walked up behind him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're ready for this," she said, her voice steady. "You've been ready." Jonathan nodded, taking a deep breath. This isn't just about the airline anymore. It's about setting an example for every company that thinks they can get away with this. Melanie smiled. "And you're the right person to lead that charge." Jonathan kissed her cheek, then turned to Caleb and Emma, who were eating breakfast at the table. "Wish me luck, kids." Caleb grinned. "You don't need luck, Dad. You've got Mom." Emma giggled, and Melanie laughed. He's not wrong. The committee meeting took place in a spacious conference room at the airline's headquarters. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, flanked by a diverse group of experts in civil rights, corporate ethics, and aviation. Robert Steele and Mark Reynolds were also present, their expressions a mix of unease and determination. Jonathan opened the meeting with a clear and powerful statement. This committee exists to hold this company accountable, not just for what happened to my family, but for every person who has been excluded, disrespected, or discriminated against. We're not here to protect the airline's image. We're here to change its culture. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Then one of the civil rights experts, a woman named Dr. Angela Price, spoke up. Well said, Mr. Davis. Let's get to work. The first order of business was reviewing the airline's hiring and training practices. The committee uncovered glaring gaps, including a lack of diversity in leadership and inadequate bias training for frontline employees. Jonathan pushed for immediate changes, including mandatory training and a commitment to hiring more people from underrepresented backgrounds. Next, they addressed the complaint system, which had allowed incidents like the gate agent's behavior to go unchecked. The committee proposed a complete overhaul, ensuring complaints were handled independently and transparently. Throughout the meeting, Jonathan's resolve never wavered. He challenged vague promises, demanded concrete timelines, and refused to let the airline's executives sidestep accountability. By the end of the day, the committee had laid the groundwork for sweeping reforms. As Jonathan left the meeting, his phone buzzed with a message from Alicia Carter. Jonathan, another whistleblower just came forward. Call me ASAP. Jonathan dialed her number as soon as he reached his car. Alicia answered immediately, her voice urgent. This new whistleblower is a current employee in upper management, she said. They're claiming there's been an effort to suppress evidence related to your case. Emails, internal reports, they're saying it's being buried. Jonathan's stomach dropped. Do they have proof? They do, Alicia said. They've sent me copies of the emails, and it's damning. This goes higher than anyone thought. Jonathan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Send me what you have. I will, Alicia said. But you need to be careful. If this is true, the people involved won't go down without a fight. That evening, Jonathan and Melanie reviewed the new evidence. The emails revealed a deliberate effort by several executives to cover up discriminatory practices and silence complaints. It was a calculated and coordinated operation, designed to protect the airline's reputation at all costs. This is bigger than we imagined, Melanie said, her voice filled with anger. They didn't just ignore the problem, they actively hid it. Jonathan nodded, his jaw tightening. And we're going to expose every single one of them. The next morning, Jonathan called an emergency meeting with the Oversight Committee. He presented the new evidence, sparking outrage among the members. This changes everything, Dr. Angela Price said. We need to expand the investigation to include these cover-ups. Jonathan agreed. And we need to take this public. The only way to ensure real accountability is to shine a light on what's been happening behind closed doors. The committee voted unanimously to release a statement, condemning the cover-ups and calling for an independent audit of the airline's practices. The statement was picked up by major news outlets, intensifying the public scrutiny on the company. As the pressure mounted, Robert Steele called Jonathan for another meeting. This time, Robert's tone was different, more desperate. Jonathan, we need to talk, Robert said. The situation is spiraling out of control. Jonathan's voice was cold. It's not spiraling, it's finally coming to light. I know, Robert said. And I want to help. But we need to work together to get through this. Jonathan hesitated, then said, fine. But this time, you're going to tell me everything. The meeting took place in Robert's office, where he revealed the full extent of the cover-up. Several high-ranking executives had conspired to suppress complaints and manipulate records, all to maintain the company's image. They thought they were protecting the airline, Robert said, his voice heavy with regret. But they were destroying it. Jonathan's expression was steely. And now they're going to face the consequences. Robert nodded. I'll cooperate fully with the investigation. But I need your help to rebuild what's left. Jonathan stood, his resolve unwavering. If you want my help, you'll start by cleaning house. Everyone involved in this cover-up needs to go. Robert nodded slowly. Agreed. As Jonathan left the meeting, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but the truth was finally coming to light. And with every step forward, he knew they were making history, not just for his family, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. The fallout from the new revelations was immediate and devastating for the airline. News of the cover-up spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and evening broadcasts. Shareholders were furious, demanding resignations at the highest levels. Consumer advocacy groups called for boycotts, and social media was ablaze with outrage. Jonathan watched the chaos unfold with a mix of satisfaction and determination. While the airline's leadership scrambled to contain the damage, the Oversight Committee doubled down on their efforts. Jonathan worked tirelessly, alongside Melanie and the rest of the committee, to ensure the momentum wasn't lost. 1 week later, the committee convened again, this time with a much larger agenda. The independent auditors hired to investigate the airline presented their preliminary findings, which painted a damning picture of systemic failures. The issues are deeply entrenched, the lead auditor explained, scrolling through a presentation. This isn't just a few bad actors. It's a culture that prioritizes profit and image over ethics. Dr. Angela Price leaned forward, her voice sharp. And what's your recommendation for fixing it? The auditor paused, then said, complete structural reform. That includes replacing most of the senior leadership team, instituting independent oversight of all operations, and implementing mandatory diversity and bias training across the board. Jonathan nodded. Good. And we need timelines. No vague promises. The auditor smiled faintly. We'll have a full report, with actionable steps and deadlines, ready by next week. Meanwhile, Alicia Carter continued to receive tips from whistleblowers within the airline. One particularly explosive revelation came from a former HR executive, who confirmed that complaints from passengers of color were routinely dismissed or altered to downplay the incidents. Jonathan knew this was the moment to take the fight even further. With Alicia's help, he coordinated interviews with several whistleblowers, ensuring their voices were heard. The interviews aired on national television, creating a groundswell of support for the reforms Jonathan and the committee were pushing. The pressure finally became too much for the airline's leadership. Robert Steele called an emergency press conference, flanked by the remaining members of the executive team. His face was pale but composed as he addressed the cameras. We failed, Robert began. As CEO, I take full responsibility for the culture and policies that allowed these injustices to occur. Effective immediately, I am stepping down. The announcement sent shockwaves through the industry. While some viewed it as a necessary step, others questioned whether it was merely a symbolic gesture. For Jonathan, it was a small but significant victory. The resignation marked a turning point in the battle. With the old guard gone, the Oversight Committee gained more control over the airline's operations. Jonathan worked closely with the interim leadership team to implement the reforms outlined in the auditor's report. One of the most critical changes was the creation of an independent passenger advocacy group, which would serve as a watchdog for the airline's policies. Jonathan ensured the group was diverse and empowered, with the authority to hold the company accountable. Despite the progress, the fight wasn't without challenges. The airline's financial struggles became more apparent as boycotts and bad press continued to take their toll. Shareholders grew restless, questioning whether the company could survive the reforms. Jonathan addressed their concerns head-on during a shareholder meeting. Standing at the podium, he delivered a powerful speech. This company's survival depends on its willingness to change, he said. If we cling to the old ways, we'll lose the trust of the people who keep us in business. But if we lead the way, if we become a model for accountability and inclusion, we'll come out stronger. His words resonated, and the shareholders voted to support the reforms. The tide began to turn. As the airline implemented the changes, public perception slowly shifted. The company's transparency and commitment to reform won back some of its critics, and passenger satisfaction surveys showed signs of improvement. Jonathan knew there was still a long road ahead, but he also knew they were moving in the right direction. One evening, as Jonathan and Melanie sat on their balcony, watching the sunset, Caleb and Emma joined them. Caleb climbed onto Jonathan's lap, while Emma leaned against Melanie. "Dad," Caleb said, his voice curious. "Are you going to fix the airplanes forever?" Jonathan smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Not forever, buddy. But I'm going to make sure they're fair for everyone." Emma looked up. "Even for people who aren't rich." "Especially for them," Melanie said, her voice soft but firm. Caleb grinned. "That's cool." Jonathan and Melanie exchanged a glance, their resolve reflected in each other's eyes. The fight had taken a toll, but it had also strengthened their family and their belief in doing what was right. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan felt a rare sense of peace. The battle wasn't over, but they had already accomplished so much. Together, they would see it through to the end. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Jonathan's oversight committee worked tirelessly to push through the reforms outlined in the auditor's report. The airline's new leadership team, carefully selected to reflect the values of accountability and diversity, began rebuilding trust with employees and customers. But not everyone was on board with the changes. A small but vocal group of employees resisted the new policies, claiming they were unnecessary and disruptive. Jonathan anticipated this backlash and addressed it head-on. During an employee town hall, he stood before a packed room, his voice firm but calm. "I understand change can be uncomfortable," Jonathan said. "But discomfort is necessary when we're dismantling systems that have hurt people for far too long. This isn't about punishing anyone, it's about creating an environment where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. And that benefits all of us." His words were met with a mix of nods and skeptical stares, but Jonathan didn't waver. He knew the resistance would take time to overcome. Meanwhile, Melanie became a driving force behind the airline's community outreach initiatives. She spearheaded a scholarship program for underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation, as well as partnerships with organizations advocating for racial equity. One morning, as Melanie reviewed applications for the scholarship program, she came across a letter from a young woman named Jada. In it, Jada described her dream of becoming a pilot and the challenges she faced as a black woman in a field dominated by men. "She reminds me of us," Melanie said, showing the letter to Jonathan. "Determined, resourceful, but in need of someone to open a door." Jonathan smiled. "Then let's open it for her." Jada became one of the first scholarship recipients, and her story was shared widely, inspiring others to pursue their dreams despite the odds. As the airline's reforms took hold, public perception continued to improve. Passenger advocacy groups praised the company's transparency, and customer satisfaction ratings rose steadily. Jonathan's efforts became a case study in corporate accountability, drawing attention from other industries grappling with similar issues. But with the progress came a new challenge. The airline's financial recovery was slow, and Jonathan worried about whether they could sustain the reforms without losing the trust they had worked so hard to rebuild. One evening, during a meeting with the new CEO, a woman named Renee Taylor, Jonathan raised his concerns. "We're doing the right thing, but the financial pressure is mounting," Jonathan said. "How do we keep this going?" Renee nodded thoughtfully. "It's a delicate balance. But I believe people will support a company that stands for something. We just need to show them we're serious about our commitment." Jonathan leaned forward. "Then let's be bold. Let's launch a campaign, not about flights or prices, but about values. Let's tell people who we are now and why it matters." Renee smiled. "I like that. Let's do it." The campaign, titled "Everyone Belongs," launched with a powerful video featuring passengers and employees sharing their stories. It highlighted the airline's journey toward accountability and the changes they had made to ensure a more inclusive experience for all. The campaign struck a chord, resonating with people across the country. Bookings began to rise, and the airline's reputation started to rebuild. Jonathan felt a sense of pride, not just for the company, but for what they had achieved together. One afternoon, Jonathan received an unexpected invitation to speak at a national conference on corporate ethics. The invitation was a testament to the impact of his work, but it also came with a weight of responsibility. Melanie encouraged him to accept. "Your story can inspire others to demand better, not just in aviation but everywhere." Jonathan agreed and began preparing his speech. When the day of the conference arrived, he stood before an audience of executives, employees, and advocates, sharing his journey. "This wasn't a fight I wanted," Jonathan said. "It was a fight I had to take on, for my family, for others like us, and for the future. Change isn't easy, but it's always worth it. And if we can do it, so can you." The audience erupted into applause, and Jonathan felt a surge of hope. This was bigger than him now. It was a movement. Back at home, life began to settle into a new normal. Caleb and Emma returned to their routines, blissfully unaware of the significance of what their parents had accomplished. Melanie continued her work with the scholarship program, while Jonathan remained deeply involved with the oversight committee. One evening, as the family sat together on the couch, Caleb asked a question that caught Jonathan off guard. "Dad, are you a hero?" Jonathan chuckled. pulling his son close. No, buddy. I'm just someone who tried to do the right thing. Emma tilted her head. But isn't that what heroes do? Jonathan glanced at Melanie, who smiled warmly. Maybe, Jonathan said. But I couldn't have done it without your mom, and without you two reminding me what's really important. Caleb grinned. So we're heroes too? Melanie laughed. The best kind. As the family sat together, Jonathan felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought them closer and created a legacy of change that would endure. For the first time in months, Jonathan allowed himself to exhale, knowing the future was brighter, not just for his family, but for everyone who believed in fairness, justice, and the power of doing what's right. Months passed, and the airline's transformation became a beacon of hope for other corporations facing similar reckonings. The reforms implemented by Jonathan and the Oversight Committee had not only reshaped the airline but also inspired a broader conversation about accountability, equity, and inclusion across industries. The scholarship program Melanie championed flourished, opening doors for young people like Jada to pursue careers in aviation. Jonathan stayed in touch with Jada, mentoring her and watching with pride as she earned her pilot's license and became a role model for others. The Davis family's life slowly returned to normal. Caleb and Emma thrived at school, and the family found joy in simple moments: movie nights, beach trips, and quiet evenings at home. Jonathan and Melanie remained deeply committed to their work but never let it overshadow the bond they shared as a family. One evening, the family sat together around the dinner table, discussing their upcoming vacation. Caleb and Emma were buzzing with excitement, eager to visit a new destination. "Are we flying first class again?" Caleb asked, his eyes wide. Jonathan smiled. "We are. And you know what? This time, we're just going to enjoy the trip. No drama, no distractions." Melanie laughed. "That sounds perfect." As they cleared the table, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert about the airline's latest passenger satisfaction rankings, the highest in the company's history. The headline read, "Airline soars as symbol of change, thanks to Davis family leadership." Jonathan showed Melanie the article, and they exchanged a look of quiet pride. The journey had been hard-fought, but seeing the tangible impact of their efforts made it all worthwhile. Months later, the airline hosted a special event to honor the achievements of the Oversight Committee and announce the permanent establishment of the Independent Passenger Advocacy Group. Jonathan was invited to deliver the keynote speech, an opportunity to reflect on the journey and the lessons learned. Standing on the stage, he looked out at the audience, a mix of passengers, employees, and community leaders. His heart swelled with gratitude and determination as he began to speak. "This journey started with an injustice," Jonathan said. "My family was judged, excluded, and humiliated because of the color of our skin. But instead of walking away, we chose to fight, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel less than. We learned that change doesn't come easily. It takes courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But it also takes unity. None of this would have been possible without the people who joined us in this fight. My wife Melanie, our children, the Oversight Committee, the whistleblowers, and countless others who refused to stay silent. This isn't the end of the story. It's a beginning, a chance to build something better. And my hope is that what we've done here inspires others to stand up, speak out, and demand the fairness and respect we all deserve. Because in the end, the message is simple: everyone belongs." The room erupted into applause, a standing ovation that filled Jonathan with a deep sense of fulfillment. He stepped off the stage and joined Melanie, who hugged him tightly. "You nailed it," she said with a grin. Jonathan chuckled. "I just told the truth." As the event concluded, the Davis family returned to their seats, watching as people mingled and celebrated the progress made. Caleb and Emma, now old enough to understand the significance of what their parents had accomplished, looked up at Jonathan and Melanie with admiration. "You're heroes," Emma said quietly. Jonathan knelt beside her, his eyes warm. "No, sweetheart. We just did what was right. And that's what heroes do," Caleb added with a smile. Jonathan and Melanie exchanged a glance, their hearts full. In that moment, they knew they had not only changed the course of an airline but also set an example for their children, and the world, about the power of standing up for justice. As they left the event and stepped into the cool night air, Jonathan took Melanie's hand, their children walking ahead of them, laughing and chatting. The future felt bright, not just for their family but for everyone who believed in fairness, dignity, and the simple truth that everyone belongs. It was a long road, but they had reached their destination. And together, they were ready for whatever came next.